This type of writing is useful if one wants to hide their meaning. And in political language, this is everything. For those who climb to power must always portray their reasons for doing so as noble. They did it for truth, God, and justice. This is rarely true. Power has always been acquired for power's sake. Orwell realized this and realized that this trick is often masked by language. Leaders, politicians, and media often use soft language to mask a brutal reality. British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations under Stalin, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan, can be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face, and which do not align with the professed aims of the political parties. Euphemism is what makes up the majority of our political language. Defenseless villages are bombed from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gun in the home set on fire. This was called pacification. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them. This is the trick. You use a nice name for a horrific thing. Political writing and speech is often a defense of the indefensible. Very often the words chosen directly contradict the ideas they represent. Words have lost all connection to meaning. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and it is designed to give a sense of solidity to pure wind. This kind of speech is not hard to recognize, so the speaker is dependent on one key fact about human nature, and that is the individual's desire to deceive himself. We all have a story, a sort of internal narrative which shapes our identity and molds our perception. In 1984, the narrative was that Big Brother was omnipotent and the party was infallible. But because Big Brother was not omnipotent and the party was not infallible, there was need for an unwarying, moment-to-moment flexibility in the treatment of facts. One needed control over their own mental processes as complete as that of a contortionist over his body. In Newspeak, this was called doublethink. Doublethink lies at the very heart of Ingsoc way of life, since the essential act of the party is to use conscious deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty. To tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them. To deny the existence of objective reality, and all the while to take account of the reality which one denies. All of this is indispensably necessary. This brings up the question, why must reality be distorted in this manner? Why must the narrative pervade every layer of the societal structure? It is important to realize that power is in the collective. Alone, every human being will fail, because every human being is doomed to die. But if he can make complete, utter submission, if he can escape his identity, if he can merge himself into the party so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal. You see then why you must never lose faith in the infallibility of your country or political group. If you were to lose faith in your family, your country, or your religion, suddenly every other part of your existence must be called into question. These things make up the foundation of how you interpret the world, and if they collapse, your entire structure of beliefs will collapse with it. This is why, above all, the story, the narrative, and the mythology must remain intact, and why you will follow your culture down whatever path it leads you. This is footage of the Soviet Union under the rule of Joseph Stalin. From his rise to power in 1924 and his death in 1953, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of 30 to 50 million Russian citizens. 14 million people were imprisoned in the labor camps from 1929 to 1953. Half of all political prisoners were detained without a trial. Secret police patrolled the streets, and 1 in 3 citizens were government spies. For those of us who are not there, we will never truly understand the atmosphere of suspicion, brutality, and neighbor spying on neighbor, which made up day-to-day life. When George Orwell wrote Animal Farm in 1984, he was not writing about some future society. He was writing about the world he saw right in front of his eyes. Not merely the brutality of the communist regime, but the fact that the rest of the world chose to be willfully blind to what was happening. You have to understand, at this time, no media outlet was willing to print any material which was critical of the Soviet Union. Especially not a book like Animal Farm, clearly depicting Stalin as the paranoid, deceitful pig Napoleon. When Orwell finished the book in 1943, no publisher would touch it. For the world had just witnessed the Soviet forces defeat the seemingly unstoppable army of Hitler. So collectively, we stuck our head in the sand, because that was the convenient thing to do. George Orwell was the worst kind of political writer. He had the terrible habit of telling people precisely what they did not want to hear. We tend to think of an oppressive regime as containing two categories of people: the oppressive ruling class and the innocent people who are being oppressed. We think of tyranny as something which comes from the top down, but a system like that simply would not function. A pathological political system is corrupted from its leadership right down to the level of the individual. Regimes like that of Stalin or Hitler required the willing participation of a mass amount of people. This does not fit very well with our perception of what happened. It is much easier to look at history as a case of black and white, right and wrong, or good and evil. And each of us would like to believe, if we were put in that situation, we would take the side of good. If only it were that simple. If only there were some unmistakable mark of evil, we could simply separate the good from the bad. But the line between good and evil does not pass through political parties, nor states, nor social classes, but right through every human heart. This runs absolutely counter to what we would like to believe. We'd like our villains out in the open, where they can be easily identified. But it was not good men or bad men who were behind the horrors of Auschwitz and Soviet Russia. It was ordinary men. People just like you and me. To truly understand Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia is to understand that ordinary people, meaning you and I, if we were put in that situation, we would have done what ordinary people did. If we grew up in Nazi Germany under the same influences, it is highly likely that we would have been Nazis. It is highly unlikely that we would have done otherwise. To consider yourself unsusceptible to enormous social pressure is to consider yourself not human. What every totalitarian state had in common was a layer of deceit embedded within its culture and within its language, and a willingness of the individual to accept and act out endless lies. This is what Orwell so eloquently brought to light in Politics in the English Language. And if you only read one article in your life, make it this one. Speaking in an imprecise manner lays the groundwork for a society built on conscious deception. And it starts at the level of the individual. We cannot lay responsibility at the feet of another. For the enemy is not some dictator in a faraway land. When we realize the enemy lies within our own hearts, suddenly, one becomes two. We have found the enemy, and he is us.
Nightlight in my bed, not safe and sound in my own head. Light won't keep my shadow away. Are you okay? There's monsters in my head, and there's nothing you can do. I left the party with glitter still in my hand. Should have stayed home tonight, but you knew that I'd come. We were drinking in your friend's room. There was nothing to regret, yeah. There was nothing to regret until you tried to kiss me.